business explainer. If you're a business leader trying to figure out exactly where your margins, costs, and capital are heading over the next few years, well, you're in the right place. Today, we're stripping away all that dense academic jargon to give you a high-level, actionable intelligence report on the UK economy. We're going to take a deep dive into an incredibly powerful macroeconomic model to see what it's really telling us about the future.
All right, let's dive right in. 149. Now, what's that mean? That number actually represents 149 quarters. So we're talking nearly 37 years of macroeconomic data, all synthesized to reveal the true state of the market. We aren't just looking at a quick snapshot of yesterday's news. We're analyzing decades of historical market reactions running all the way from 1989 right through to the projections for early 2026. We know you're time poor, and you need signal, not noise. So here is our quick roadmap for today. 1. Decoding the UK economy. 2. The big picture covering growth and inflation. 3. Interest rates and monetary policy. 4. Hidden forces and economic shocks. And 5. The executive summary and takeaways.
Okay, moving right into Section 1, Decoding the UK economy.
So before we can really trust any forecast, we've got to understand the tool behind it, right? The data we're unpacking today comes from a Bayesian DSGE model. Now, I know that sounds incredibly complex, but essentially a dynamic stochastic general equilibrium model is just a powerful mathematical simulator. In plain English, it's an advanced simulation of how economic actors, think consumers, corporations, and central banks, how they all respond to unexpected shocks over time. It literally calculates the hidden realities that drive market behavior.
To actually get to these insights, the model had to ingest a massive dataset, 179 distinct economic variables to be exact. But to find the real signal in all that noise, it filtered everything down to isolate the 8 absolute most critical indicators. We're talking things like inflation, GDP growth, and policy rates. It basically takes this chaotic sea of data and distills it down into one clear picture for us to analyze.
Right, on to Section 2, Big Picture, Growth and Inflation.
Now, this right here is the absolute most critical part for your immediate forecasting and strategic planning. We're looking at the model's baseline steady state findings. And, a steady state in economics is basically the economy's resting pulse when you strip away all the temporary fluctuations. And the findings here? They're pretty stark. The model suggests a structural reality of near 10.87% annualized inflation and negative 0.52% growth, alongside a tiny real interest rate of 0.35%. Let that sink in for a second. This is not a temporary blip. The math is telling us this high inflation, low growth environment is actually deeply baked into the current structure of the economy. And this illustrates exactly why we should trust these numbers. If you look at the top chart for inflation, the black line, showing actual historical data, is almost perfectly tracked by the red dashed line, which represents the model's fitted values. It maps the past 37 years with an exceptionally high R-squared of 0.94. It even tightly maps that massive drop in policy rates we saw around 2008. When an economic model understands the past with this level of accuracy, we absolutely have to take its warnings about structural inflation seriously.
Let's turn to Section 3, Interest Rates and Monetary Policy.
With an inflation baseline resting that high, we really need to carefully examine the central bank's response. And the underlying math of their mechanism is incredibly revealing. The data explicitly states that the Taylor principle is not satisfied. Take a look at that psi1 value of 0.078. In macroeconomics, a value below 1 basically means the central bank's interest rate response is mathematically too weak to curb inflation. So what happens is, when inflation goes up, nominal interest rates just don't rise fast enough to offset it, meaning real interest rates actually fall. So this immediately begs a totally critical strategic question for your treasury teams. Is the central bank actually doing enough to fight inflation? Well, according to the model, the answer is a mathematical no. And that has massive, massive implications for your long-term cost of capital and exactly how you should be looking at corporate debt restructuring right now.
Tracing this trajectory leading into 2026, notice those extreme spikes in inflation shown in purple, contrasted with the nominal interest rates in orange. The peaks in interest rates, while definitely severe, are highly volatile and structurally misaligned with actually stabilizing those massive inflation spikes. It's wild to see, but this volatility really underscores the inherent weakness of current monetary policy interventions. Essentially, the policy is just chasing the problem, not actually solving it. Okay, moving on to Section 4, Hidden Forces, Economic Shocks. If the central bank isn't effectively steering the ship, well, these invisible forces are.
We're seeing massive structural fluctuations here. Look at how the natural rate of interest has plunged so dramatically since the 2008 financial crisis. But the real story exposes some severe structural shocks, massive, highly volatile supply shocks in red, alongside dramatic, deeply negative financial shocks in purple. These forces are literally what's dragging the economy away from any kind of stability.
Drilling down into the specific data for the most recent quarters leading up to early 2026, the model quantifies an environment that is totally dominated by two conflicting extremes. On one hand, we see persistent positive supply shocks staying strong right around zero point 0.3. But then, look at the monetary policy shocks right next to them. They are aggressively negative, running from minus 4.9 down to minus 3.3. So the policy environment is just severely disjointed from the physical supply-side realities of the market.
Which brings us to Section 5, Executive Summary and Takeaways.
So, the big question, how do we actually translate this highly technical econometric data into real-world boardroom strategy? Well, the bottom line is this. As executives, you absolutely must prepare your organizations for a high baseline inflation environment. You're going to have to navigate a structural economic contraction, especially given that negative 0.5% baseline growth we talked about. And perhaps most importantly, do not rely on monetary policy to quickly stabilize prices. The data clearly shows that the structural economic guardrails are currently weakened. You have to build resilient pricing power and fiercely protect your margins internally, because, mathematically speaking, external macroeconomic help just isn't there. I want to leave you with this final provocative thought to take back to your C-suite. How is your company really positioned to handle a prolonged macro environment of high inflation and sluggish growth? If this sophisticated model is right, the old playbook from the last 2 decades, it's just not going to work. The real question is, are you ready for the new reality? Thank you so much for joining me to unpack this explainer, and I'll catch you on the next one.